This video is a multi-part series about everything related to vulnerability management. Vulnerability management got you down? Well, join the club. There's stacks and stacks of vulnerabilities ever increasing in our interconnected world, leading to a very depressing work environment for people working in cybersecurity vulnerability management. The main issue with vulnerability management is that year over year, there's an ever increasing amount of vulnerabilities on our systems. The folks at SANS came up with a model for vulnerability management called PACT. The acronym PACT stands for Vulnerability Management Preparation, Vulnerability Identification, Vulnerability Analysis and Assessment, Vulnerability Management Communication, and Vulnerability Management Treatment. Reviewing the PAC process, first prepare is what is your vulnerability management policies and procedures? What are the frameworks that guide your vulnerability management program for cybersecurity like NIST, CIS, et cetera? What's your governance? And are your data and systems properly classified? Next, moving on to identification. What identification deals with what are your actual vulnerabilities on your systems? What's your process? How do you find vulnerabilities on your systems? A big part of identification for vulnerabilities is something called scanning. Next is analyze, assess. Usually you do this after you have your scan or other results. A big part of that is validating if there's false positives. Categorizing your vulnerabilities, rating them for cost effectiveness, also dealing with prioritizing. What should you work on to fix first? And also tracking your vulnerabilities over time. The next part of PAC deals with communications related to your vulnerability management, your vulnerabilities and vulnerability management. What reporting procedures do you have? Do you have alerting related to more serious vulnerabilities? What types of metrics do you use to track your program? The next part of the PAC process deals with treatment. A large part of treating your vulnerabilities is your patch management program. Also, your configuration management program plays a huge part here to configure secure systems that are vulnerable. And then change management also plays a large role in treating your vulnerabilities. Now let's talk about your vulnerability management program maturity, how it relates to PACT. Within IT, there's a popular model called CMMI, stands for capability maturity. You can map the PACT process across the y-axis: prepare, identify, assess, communicate, and treat. And then the five stages of maturity: initial, manage, defined, quantitatively manage, and optimize, with optimize being the best capabilities of your program. So for example, having a scanner doing scheduled scans is an area of PAC related identification, identifying your vulnerabilities. That would put you at the level of defined in your program maturity for vulnerability management. Now we're going to give a quick overview of the next videos that we're going to talk about in this vulnerability management series. So part 2 of this series, we're going to cover the word scanning. It's one of the most loaded words in cybersecurity and is often used incorrectly. Scanning, this super loaded word in cybersecurity. We're going to talk about system scanning versus code scanning. And then we're going to dive into the main 3 types of system scanning: host enumeration discovery scanning, vulnerability scanning, and compliance scanning. Next, in part 3 of this video series in vulnerability management, we're going to talk about deploying a robust vulnerability management system. So we're going to dive into how to deploy and manage a scanning system for vulnerabilities. So your network and infrastructure has many systems, and you'll need a device called a scanner to scan those systems for vulnerabilities. And there's tools on the market called Orchestrator that helps you control and manage your vulnerability management scanners. We'll also talk about setting up your scanners and diving into the elements of the scan. The elements of the scan include your targets to be scanned, the actual scanner used to scan those targets, your scan schedule, when the scans will be run, your scan credentials, because it's important that your scanners are able to log on to the systems to find their vulnerabilities, your scan policy, which deals with the type of scan, the speed, the plugins to check for, and then your scan results, which deals with reporting the scan results at the end of the vulnerability, at the end of the system. In part 4 of this series, we're going to talk about the numerous problems of evaluating vulnerabilities. It's a headache for pretty much everyone working in vulnerability management. As part of this training, we're going to talk about evaluating vulnerabilities. And the historical way to evaluate vulnerabilities used in cybersecurity is something called the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, and how it rates vulnerabilities on a scale of 1 to 10, with critical vulnerabilities rating a score of 9 to 10, high a score of 7 to 9, medium 4 to 7, and low 0 to 4. The CVSS system is useful for tracking vulnerabilities, but has its problems. So currently, it's on the version 3 standard. The CVSS score is supposed to be based off of 3 different metrics: base metrics, temporal metrics, and environmental metrics. Every vulnerability gets a vector string and an identification number. So this CV 2022-22954 is a vulnerability that was discovered in 2022, the year 2022. And here's an example of the vector string. So it deals with different ways the vulnerability is categorized. So for example, AV stands for attack vector. If you need to be local to the system, or N is over the network. The problem is the scanners don't know your environment, so they rate all these vulnerabilities based off of the base metric only, which creates problems because there's so many vulnerabilities, it doesn't really give you a proper prioritization. So a lot of vendors are coming up with something called VPR, vulnerability priority rating, to add additional intelligence to decision makers about how to rate their vulnerabilities. Next word is part 5 of this series. In part 5 of this vulnerability management series, we're going to discuss treating and tracking vulnerabilities. After all, it's good to find vulnerabilities, but if you don't have a mature process for fixing and patching them, your program's not going to be that mature. So how do you track the vulnerabilities, and how do you track the fixes for them? And there's mountains and mountains of vulnerabilities, so you have to have a robust program for tracking all these vulnerabilities and their fixes. How you track vulnerabilities within your systems is becomes really important to the vulnerability management process and maturity. So the way most people track vulnerabilities is, let's say you have 3 systems, and each of those 3 systems has a vulnerability A, B, and C. Each of the 3 has them. So system 1, and they're tracking, they'll say that system 1 has vulnerabilities A, B, and C. The second system in the middle there also has vulnerabilities A, B, and C. And then down all the way to, however many systems you have. In this picture, it's 3, let's say it's 1,000. So they'll say, okay, we have thousands of these systems. They each have 3 of these critical vulnerabilities. So on my system entirely, I have 3,000 vulnerabilities. An easier way to track this construct is, let's say it's vulnerability A on your systems. Well, you say, okay, I have it on systems one, two, and three, or through 1,000, whatever. Vulnerability B, I have that on systems one, two, and three, etc. Vulnerability C, I have on systems one, two, and three. So now I'm not tracking essentially 1,000 rows. I'm only tracking 3 rows, and I'm saying I have this vulnerability, and these are the systems that I have it. Tracking vulnerabilities by vulnerability is great, but there's actually even a better way to do it. So oftentimes your systems will be separate, and the vulnerabilities on those systems will be separate to those systems. So, for example, you have Linux systems in your environment, they'll have a set of vulnerabilities, and Windows systems will have a set of vulnerabilities. Oftentimes, you'll have different personnel and processes. For example, you have Linux system admins, they might do kernel packaging for the Linux vulnerabilities. And you might have Windows sysadmins, they'll use the Windows Update Service to patch the Windows vulnerabilities monthly. They're separate responsible parties and they have separate timelines. So, for example, Bob, your system admin, he's got vulnerabilities identified on his Linux systems. So you'll talk to him, you'll arrange, and he may be on a schedule and say, I can patch those systems in 2 weeks. So, and that might fit with his work schedule and his plan for patching. So he goes ahead and patches those systems. And for you overall in your vulnerability management system, it makes it a lot easier to track. You know, Bob's responsible and he's going to fix all these vulnerabilities on these systems in 2 weeks. And if he doesn't, you know who to follow up with. In part 6 of this series, we're going to discuss vulnerability management program metrics and reporting. We're going to discuss some key metrics related to vulnerability management and metrics. So one is scanner coverage. How many of the systems in your environment are you actually scanning on a regular basis for vulnerability? The other is credential scanning percentage. How many of those systems in your environment is your scanner actually logging into, which is an important factor in determining vulnerabilities. Also, there's other metrics that are very useful. And one, for example, is the CISA catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities. How many of these are on your critical systems? Next, there, as we talked about before, a lot of the scanning systems are giving additional insight into the vulnerability priority rating. In addition, it's additional data values related above the base CVSS score. How many criticals and highs of those are on your critical systems? Another good metric to have is from your when you identify the vulnerability, like how long does it take to resolve and fix it? Another good metric is how long does it take to detect and find your vulnerability? And this CISA catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities, how many of those are on your other systems that may not be critical? And then how many of your critical VPRs are on your other systems that may not be as important? Finally, if you want more information about cybersecurity materials and training and see the other parts of this vulnerability management series, see my blog and YouTube channel. My blog is Croninity, and my YouTube channel is